We are here today for a webinar from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft on the U.S. Australia Alliance and the Asian Order. The Quincy Institute is an action-oriented think tank focused on foreign policy based in Washington that advocates a grand strategy of restraint. We aim to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy, economic engagement, and the combating of existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is a norm and war the exception. As the Labour government in Canberra completes a full year in office, we have received more details about AUKUS, the ambitious U.S., U.K., Australia military pact that aims to equip the Australian Navy with nuclear-powered submarines and launch new collaborations in defense technology. We have also seen a thaw of sorts taking place between Beijing and Canberra, with Beijing's informal trade sanctions being eased to a degree. Meanwhile, President Biden will be in Australia in 2 weeks for a summit of the four-nation Quad, which also includes Japan and India. Can Australia moderate the U.S. China rivalry? What are the promises and pitfalls of the AUKUS Pact? What is the future of Canberra's relations with Beijing? I'm Sarang Shidore, Director of Studies and Senior Research Fellow here at the Quincy Institute, welcoming you. And I have 3 excellent panelists today who will help us get to the bottom of all these and other questions. So I'm going to start by introducing them, and then we'll go from there. First up, I have Sam Raghuven. He's a director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. Before joining the Lowy Institute, he was a senior strategic analyst in Australia's peak intelligence agency, the Office of National Assessments. Sam is a regular commentator on the Lowy Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, of which he was the founding editor from 2007 to 2014. Sam also has a long-standing interest in domestic politics, and in 2019, he wrote a book titled Our Very Own Brexit, Australia's Hollow Politics and Where It Could Lead Us. Sam also serves as editor of the Lowy Institute's flagship publication, the Lowy Institute Papers. I also have here Hugh White, who is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. He spent much of his career in the Australian government, including as International Relations Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Department of Defense. He was the founding editor of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and from 2004 to 2011, he was head of ANU's Strategic and Defense Studies Center. His major publications, and there are quite a few, but those include The China Choice, Why America Should Share Power in 2012, and most recently, How to Defend Australia in 2019. I also have here Beck Strating. She's the director of La Trobe Asia and an associate professor in politics and international relations in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe University in Melbourne. Her research focuses on maritime disputes in Asia and Australian foreign and defense policy. Her most recent book is titled Defending the Maritime Rules-Based Order in 2020, and she's also co-edited another book in 2022 titled Australia on the World Stage. In 2019, she was awarded an Asian Studies Visiting Fellowship to research at the East-West Center. She has also been affiliated with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, Georgetown University, and the Perth U.S. Asia Center. So welcome to all 3 of you today, and thank you for being here with us. I'm going to start actually with you, Beck, and I want to sort of remind our viewers, those of you who might have missed this, that we had our 3 excellent panelists also last year, almost exactly a year ago. And Beck, when we talked last time, Anthony Albanese had just been elected as Prime Minister of Australia. And now it's been nearly a year since he's been serving as a leader of the country. So just sort of briefly, if you could tell us, what are the significant differences between Albanese's first year and his predecessor, Scott Morrison's term in office? Where do you see significant differences and where do you see continuity?
Yeah, thank you, Sarang. It's so great to be back here nearly a year later. And thank you to the Quincy Institute for hosting us. And it's always great to be on a panel with Sam and Hugh. It's a really good time, I think, to be talking about the differences and continuities in Australian foreign and defence policy. So starting with that first question about the differences. I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the key differences in thinking about foreign affairs is that we've got a much more active and high-profile foreign minister under Foreign Minister Penny Wong. I mean, she has had what appears to me to look like a punishing travel schedule, and she's been out particularly across the Indo-Pacific region, as Australia refers to it, focusing on Southeast Asia in particular, as well as the Pacific. And I think that's important for kind of elevating foreign affairs in thinking about Australia's international relations and how it thinks about security more broadly. Having a foreign minister who seems to have a bit more clout and a bit more profile in both in government but also with the public. And I think we can see this difference in a real effort to communicate with the region when it comes to how Australia tries to explain AUKUS. And we might remember, and I think we probably discussed this last time we met, but in September 2021, when the Morrison government first announced AUKUS, it was a big surprise. A lot of elites and politicians in the region were taken by surprise. There wasn't a lot of diplomacy really deployed around that announcement. Whereas, in March, when the optimal pathway for AUKUS was announced by the Albanese government, there was a very big push in the region. I think that DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, were making calls constantly to the region, trying to get the diplomacy right on that issue. So you can see a kind of elevation of the importance of foreign policy. And the other really, I think, significant area of difference is the fact that you also have a thawing of the bilateral tension between Australia and China. So I think the new government it's sort of an opportunity to reset. So, we talk about Australia being put in the Beijing freezer, particularly after foreign legislation, foreign interference legislation, and some of the kind of heated rhetoric coming out of Australia. And then there was the 2020 incident where Australia called for an inquiry into COVID-19, and then China responded with sanctions. Well, under the new Albanese government, there's a softening in some of the rhetoric around China, and there's this opening of a space for Australia and China to be talking again at a high level, among officials, which I think is an important shift. The other area I think of crucial difference is climate change, a different attitude to climate change. But I think we can possibly we'll get onto that a little bit later. But there is continuity as well. And so I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself a bit here, because I have talked about foreign policy, a bit being quite active, but at the same time, the ALP, I think, is still being led, its international outlook is still really being led by military and defence planning. And they've bought into some of the ideas of the previous government around Australia being, a regional power in this Indo-Pacific context. And we can see this in the sort of the defence planning that's going on. A couple of weeks ago, the Defence Strategic Review was released. And, one of the points that it very reasonably makes is that Australia needs a whole of government, a whole of nation strategy for dealing with, contemporary security challenges. But we've got about things the wrong way. We should have started with a national security strategy that does that and then gone into defence planning. But we've had, over the past decade, quite a number of defence white papers and strategic updates and reviews and things like that. But we haven't really had anything that's comprehensively addressing things like diplomacy, economic engagement, development, defence, how these sort of different elements of statecraft work together in order to create a coherent plan for addressing some of Australia's big security challenges.
Right. So quite a bit there. Sam, definitely a change in style. And Beck is talking about some changes in substance, perhaps not very many, but at least some. But we also have here in Washington something else that we have noticed, that we have a new ambassador from Australia, Kevin Rudd, and he's not just any other ambassador. Of course, he carries a stature well beyond that. So can you speak to that? I mean, what Beck said, but also about Kevin Rudd and what he can contribute in this conversation, how perhaps he might have a view of the China relationship that is somewhat different.
Yeah, well, he certainly does carry that status. And first of all, I should say thank you, Sarang, for the opportunity and to be here with you a year after our previous session. It's great to be part of this once again. Yes, you're right about his status as a former Prime Minister, but actually it goes a little further beyond that too. He served as Foreign Minister for a brief period, but also served as the head of the Asia Society's think tank, the Asia Society Policy Institute, and somewhere in that time found the opportunity to write a PhD as well about China. So he's kept himself very busy, and I think he is known inside the Beltway there in Washington as having really excellent high-level contacts, not only there in Washington, but also in Beijing. And I think what that might speak to is that Rudd may see his role in a very expansive sense, that that there may be a place for him in the broader context of trying to improve relations between the United States and China. Now we'll see if that develops. But if anyone could do it, if anyone has the stature and if anyone has the ambition to do it, it's certainly Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, we think so here as well. He's very loved here. Hugh, speak to some of these points. I mean, if you step back and look at the last year, what are the things that really strike you? And I'm also interested in Penny Wong. She's made quite a mark in 1 year. She's everywhere. She has given some very interesting speeches. So can you also tell us a little bit about how you see Penny Wong's contribution, her distinct presence in the government as contributing to the relationship and relations broadly with China and other countries in the neighborhood?
Yes, thanks, Sarang. Can I join Sam and Beck in saying what a pleasure it is to be back with you in this medium and to join them. Look, yes, I very much agree with Beck's sketch, I think very eloquent sketch of what's happened in the last year. I guess a couple of points I'd add. The first thing is that the rapprochement with Beijing is clearly a very significant development. We've started to see the economic sanctions, the punishment of Australia for its more assertive position in the years between 2017 and particularly after 2020, as Beck said. Those have come off and we're back in the business of talking to Beijing again, and that's a very important step. There's a couple of points to note, though. The first is that there was very much an initiative from Beijing on that, that before the election, in fact, Beijing's new ambassador to Canberra, who arrived late in 2021, made it very clear that Beijing wanted to turn the knob back up on the relationship. And so in a sense, I think, without detracting from her achievements, I think Wong was, so to speak, walking through an open door with Beijing there. The second point to make is that the really key difference between the way in which the Albanese government and Penny Wong in particular has managed relations with Beijing compared with their coalition predecessors under Scott Morrison is that I think the historians will judge that Morrison and his colleagues, particularly his Defence Minister Peter Dutton, really quite deliberately exacerbated the problems with Beijing because they thought it played well domestically. Transpired that it didn't play well domestically in Australian politics, and particularly not in electorates with large populations of Australians of Chinese origin, of which there are a very large number in some electorates. But I think the real achievement of the Albanese government is to stop using the China relationship as a domestic political football, and that's very important. I think that's very much appreciated in Beijing. Of course, the converse of that is that I don't think, and this is very significant, I don't think the Albanese government has given away anything of substance in rebuilding the relationship with Beijing, and that was obviously a very important thing to do. And of course, it's absolutely right, as Beck said, I think Penny Wong is right at the heart of this. Nobody looking at Anthony Albanese believes he's a prime minister with a very deep background, or I think very deep instincts or ideas about foreign policy. I think foreign policy is very much the domain of the foreign minister. And Penny Wong is quite a special figure in Australian politics. She is a very revered figure. She has a very cool, calm, collected manner. I think she's one of the most compelling figures in Australian politics, and she conducts herself. She's got, you might say, the perfect manner for a foreign minister. Very clear, very articulate, very forceful, but not confrontational. I think she's a good combination. On the other hand, there does remain, and again, this goes back to Beck's observations, there does remain a fundamental tension in the way in which the Australian government is trying to position itself in this, what everyone agrees is an extremely difficult period. Because on the one hand, as Beck said, Wong has made a very big emphasis on trying to rebuild Australia's credentials and the dialogue with our Southeast Asian neighbours. And she's managed this partial but important rapprochement with China, and at the same time, she's part of a government which is as committed as their predecessors were to supporting the United States, supporting the Biden administration, but also committing themselves to work with whatever administration turns up in Washington over the years ahead in its response to China. And the fundamental approach of Australian governments has not changed. That is, that our approach to dealing with the challenge we see from China is to support the United States in whatever the United States chooses to do. And there is a tension here because Wong has, on the one hand, in some major speeches, articulated an approach to the future of Asia and to America's future role in Asia, which suggests significant change. She speaks of a multipolar order in Asia. And she uses language which sounds, if I can use this phrase, rather accommodationist. Whereas I think there's no trace of that in Washington. It does seem to me that the consensus in Washington is very strongly that America's objective is to perpetuate the old US-led unipolar order in Asia. And so I think at the heart of Australia's new foreign policy, there remains a tension. You might say it's sort of an inherent tension in Australia's situation. We desperately want the United States to remain the primary power in East Asia because we see that as a necessary and sufficient condition for our security. And we have no real experience through, the 230-something years since European settlement. We have no real experience of trying to make our way in this part of the world without a dominant Anglo-Saxon power. So on the one hand, the Labor government remains as committed to that as anyone, and the AUKUS deal, of course, remains the new touchstone of that. And on the other hand, Wong is pursuing the other tradition of Australian foreign policy, which is to try and work as closely with and integrate ourselves as closely with our region. They might say that's a dilemma between our alliances and our regional partnerships, which has always been a big dynamic in Australian foreign policy, but as a rivalry between America and China has escalated, as the choices that countries all through the region have built up, Australia has found it that tension harder and harder, and I still think it remains fundamentally unresolved. So it seems to me the big questions about where Australia is going under the Albanese government in this very difficult period in East Asia remain unresolved a year into the life of the government.
Yeah, well, I think, let's say, reconciling contradictions in some form is in many ways a true mark of a thinker and strategist. So we are looking to see how Penny Wong navigates this difficult situation. Sam, I want to get to AUKUS now, get a little bit more into the meat of it. Now, since we spoke last year, there's been a lot of news on AUKUS. This year, there's been an announcement of some specifics. We know now that we are told there will be an AUKUS class submarine that will be built, mainly a British design, that will show up at some point in the 2040s, it appears. But in the intermediate time frame, to meet what Australia has called a capabilities gap, there will be these U.S. submarines, Virginia-class submarines that will be sold to Australia, but will be under Australian control once they're delivered. And there'll be 3 of these and possibly 5. So all of that we know. There's also the other part of AUKUS, which is a tech cooperation. Walk us through a little bit. Last time when we spoke, you were skeptical about 2 aspects of AUKUS. One aspect was the practicality, and the other was the strategy. So where are you today? Are you more pessimistic, less so, or something else?
No, more so on both fronts. So let's start with the actual project itself and how we bring this about. When we spoke a year ago, there was the prospect of Australia alongside the United States and the United Kingdom potentially either building new submarines of an existing design or joining in a research project for a new design. Now we're proposing to do both. So not only are we going to, as you summarised there, Sarang, not only are we going to introduce a new class of nuclear-powered submarines from the United States into our fleet, which we have no experience of doing, but then overlapping with that, we are going to build a completely new design with the United Kingdom, the so-called AUKUS class. And then I would add on top of that, we are also proposing to extend the life of our existing Collins-class submarines by taking them through a really thoroughgoing modernisation process. So effectively, we are engaging in 3 overlapping submarine projects, which is a huge lift for a country of our size. And it wouldn't shock me at all if when we come back here a year from now, the program will have changed again. And perhaps a little more than a year from now, that we see the UK part of that project, if not the whole initiative altogether, is abandoned or at least wound back substantially. I see enormous scope for that. You talked about the other part of AUKUS, so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which involves various initiatives to on the cutting edge of military technology, hypersonics, AI, underwater unmanned vehicles, etc. There's an awful lot going on there. Not an awful lot of research and development going on just yet, but there is an awful lot of activity. And at the moment, I would liken it to a kind of 3-way free trade agreement negotiation. So all 3 countries now are engaged in these very deep bureaucratic talks about how they break down these national barriers that inhibit the sharing of technology amongst them. That has still got an awful long way to run, and it's a very difficult bureaucratic process. The one other aspect of AUKUS, Sarang, that I would highlight here, though, that was announced in March, is the formation of a rotational nuclear submarine presence in Western Australia. So Australia is now going to modernise its naval base in Perth, HMAS Sterling, and that will be able to accommodate up to 4 US nuclear-powered submarines and 1 UK nuclear-powered submarine. And so as early as 2027, we will start to have a permanent rotational presence, not a base. The government is very specific that we're not allowed to call it a base, but a permanent rotational presence of US and UK nuclear-powered submarines in Perth. And I think that's perhaps been a little underplayed. So when you put that alongside a previous decision that we heard about last year to put US bombers, again, a rotational presence of US bombers in Northern Australia, where we're going to build enhanced runway and refueling and rearming facilities there so that the US can operate up to 6 long-range bombers from an airbase in the north of Australia. When you add those things together, Australia is now becoming much more integrated in American war planning than it was before. And to borrow a phrase that Hugh has used recently, we're becoming a more NATO-like ally. So not only are we rhetorically lined up with the United States, but operationally, we're much more closely integrated with the United States. I think that's a significant development and really deepens my skepticism about the way Australia is really cutting off its options to act independently in the case of an emergency over Taiwan, for instance. We are essentially pledging ourselves now to be deeply involved in a Taiwan military operation, to the extent that these facilities I talked about will almost certainly be military targets for China.
Right. Yes, I mean, all of this points to, as you said, the NATOification, if you can call it, of Australia. And although it's an ally, there's a deeper sense, there's a deeper entanglement that this indicates. So Beck, what is this all about? This is obviously not just about submarines and quantum mechanics and cyber. This is more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is more than that. But I do think that the Royal Australian Navy really does want nuclear-powered submarines. Like, partly this is kind of capability-led in the sense that, you know, that this is seen, it's being sold to the Australian public as, you know, the superior capability, and that's something that Australia needs. But the story that's being told about how it's going to help Australia defend itself is a bit mixed. It's a little bit all over the place. There seems to be a number of rationales that are provided to the Australian public about exactly how those submarines are going to help Australia contribute to regional stability. I think you know, it really began with this idea that nuclear-powered submarines have the kind of reach and the stealth to enable Australia to contribute to seas that are not close to us, but to seas that are much closer to China. So, but then that justification has tended to move around a little bit, and sometimes the Defence Minister talks more about how those submarines will be useful for defending Australia, you know, in its own maritime jurisdiction, or helping to protect sea lines of communication. But really, I think, you know, there is a sense in which these nuclear-powered submarines are seen as being an important capability for Australia. But back to your bigger point, yes, at the same time, it is more than just the capabilities themselves. It's more than just the technology sharing. I think it's a sign that Australia, you know, Hugh has written a great deal over the past 10 or 15 years on this idea of a China choice. And AUKUS, I think, is the sign where we can really go, Australia has made that choice. Australia's made up its mind on the United States, and it's made up its mind on China. So even though we have a kind of softening rhetoric where, you know, Australian politicians might talk about cooperating with China where we can, but disagreeing where we must, there's still a sense in which the major security threat to Australia is the rise of China, and that we are now kind of all in with the Americans on ensuring, or, you know, I think AUKUS is partly about Australia trying to anchor the United States in the region, to try to make sure that the US continues to be present in the region, reflecting a kind of anxiety about Australia's relationship with the US. So in some ways, you know, I think that there can be a tendency for Australia to be seen to just try to follow the US, but I think that's a misreading of some of what goes on. I think Australia is also trying to influence the US. You know, it's AUKUS is an act of sovereign decision making, but at the same time, I think that there are questions about, you know, as Sam puts it, bit about how those decisions then limit future options down the line. And I mean, my sense is that the United States probably wouldn't be prepared to sell 3 or 5 used Virginia-class submarines to Australia if it didn't think that Australia would be working on behalf of US interests in the region as well.
I just want to interrupt a little bit. I'm getting some kind of static on the video. I don't know if you are hearing it or it's just me. So I would request all of you to just mute your respective computers when you're not speaking. Maybe that'll help, or maybe it's just at my end. I don't know, but we'll just be safe here. And to our viewers, please drop any questions you have in the Q&A box that's right below the screen at the bottom, and we will take up your questions quite soon. So Hugh, I want to turn to you and pick up on 2 points that have been raised. One is what Beck said, that Australia is all in, that this is a done deal, so to speak, on China as the biggest threat, that Australia is going to march all the way on China, perhaps, if this implies that. And the other factoid I'm going to present is what, in fact, I have it here written down, what Richard Marles said when he was asked if Australia had given an implicit or explicit commitment to join a war over Taiwan. And his exact words were, absolutely not. And I couldn't be more unequivocal than that, unquote. So where do you stand on this? Is Richard Marles accurate, or is there something we're missing?
Well, it's a very important set of questions, Sarang, and I think, I mean, I very much agree with what Beck and Sam have said about this. But on those specific points, look, I think the first thing to do is Australia has a very unclear idea of exactly what's happening to its security as China's rise occurs, because there's a tendency to see China's rise as threatening Australia directly. And I don't think that's true. Australia, certainly not militarily. What China's rise does, or rather what China's challenge to the United States, using the power that it's derived from its rise over the last 4 decades, what it's doing is undermining the US-led order in Asia upon which we have depended for our security. And that does increase the possibility that China will threaten Australia in the longer term directly. Perhaps not very much. I mean, how seriously Australia has to contemplate in the decades to come the idea that China might choose to use armed force against Australia is a very important question to which there's no clear answer, but it does seem to me pretty clear that in a region in which China plays a bigger role, and particularly in a region in which China achieves its objectives and becomes the primary power and pushes the United States out, then the chances of China using armed force against Australia is higher than it has been hitherto in our history, and that requires a defence policy response. And, you know, I think in our different ways, both Sam's forthcoming book on this issue, the Echidna Strategy, and the book that I wrote a couple of years ago that you mentioned, that How to Defend Australia, are attempts to wrestle with how we should do that. But that's different, but there's a different question, and that is, should we be, instead of working out how to defend ourselves in a new era in which China is playing a much bigger and perhaps the primary role in Asia, should we be instead focusing on trying to prevent that happening by supporting the United States in its pushback against China, its attempts to defeat China's challenge to the US-led order? And this is really the big question that faces Australia today. Should we be willing to do whatever it takes to support the United States, including in war, in order to preserve the US-led order and defeat China's challenge? Now, I think the key factor in Australia deciding that is whether or not the United States is likely to succeed in doing that. And my reservation is that it's not. And my reservation about Australian policy, and this goes back to the point that Beck was making, I do think that AUKUS constitutes a very clear signal that Australia is fully committed to supporting the United States in whatever the United States does, including going to war with China, for example, over Taiwan, in attempting to sustain its position as the leading power in the Western Pacific. And if like me, you think that that's a strategy which is unlikely to succeed, then a US strategy that's unlikely to succeed, then it's a mistake for Australia to be supporting it. Now, you know, as you mentioned, the government's been, I think, attempting to argue that our decision to acquire submarines, including the US Virginia class under AUKUS, does not constitute that kind of clear commitment to Australia's support for the US. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is a difference in language between the new government and the previous government. The previous government, its defence minister, very influential defence minister, now the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, said in 2021 that it was, and this is the word he used, inconceivable that Australia wouldn't go to war against China if America did. The present government doesn't actually deny that. They don't say it's conceivable that we wouldn't. They simply refuse to discuss the issue at all. But as you mentioned, when Richard Marles, the defence minister, was pressed after the AUKUS announcement as to whether or not this committed Australia to go to war with China if America did, he very vigorously denied it in precisely the words you quoted. I think that is either very naive of Mr. Marles or misleading, because it does seem to me inconceivable that the United States would, as Sam said, be providing us with the extraordinarily sensitive technology involved in nuclear propulsion for submarines, let alone actually providing Australia with Virginia-class submarines, which will come out of the US Navy's order of battle, if it was not absolutely convinced that those capabilities would be available to the United States in the event of a conflict with China, in which the United States would have no more submarines than it needs by any stretch of the imagination. So I think there is, you know, there's a tension in the way the Australian government is presenting this issue to Australians. It does seem to me that they are pursuing a policy which presupposes very close alignment with the US policy, which I personally think is unlikely to work, and which is in fact counterproductive to Australia's interests as well as America's. And at the same time, they're kind of trying to persuade us that that's not happening. I think that's bad policy.
Well, Sarang, you're on mute.
Apologies. I was just saying that Hugh just talked of a sort of a lock-in in terms of choices. And you had also written more than a year ago about the fact that capabilities create compulsions effectively. So that begs the question, is there any space for Australia to moderate where the US may be going? Because we may not have seen all of it yet. There may be much tougher decisions that Washington may take. Decoupling may go much further. Various military strategies could ramp up. Does Australia have that space to try to rein some of this in, or is it too late?
Well, I don't think we do have an awful lot of space in that regard, but nor do I think it's too late. In fact, if anything, I would offer some questions in the other direction. I mean, Hugh focused a lot in his answer on American capabilities, and you know, does the United States actually have the right strategy and the right capabilities to maintain its military edge in this region and to maintain its leadership in the Asia Pacific? I would actually turn the question over to American resolve. Does it actually want this badly enough to do it? And that's the question. Also, the other question that Australia should be asking itself: not only is America capable of successfully pursuing a policy of maintaining its supremacy, its strategic leadership in Asia, but does it really want to do it badly enough? Now, at the moment, that may sound like a slightly quixotic question in the sense that rhetorically, American policy has so firmly taken an anti-China line, and also the entire machinery of national security in Washington, it seems, has turned over the last few years since the Trump administration towards China as the pacing threat, as the terminology goes in Washington. However, what we haven't seen very much of is actual shifts in force structure in the Asia-Pacific region. We are certainly seeing changes in force posture, but that's an important distinction. So I would actually put the news from March of the rotational presence in Perth. I would put that together with the other announcement about the bombers in Darwin. There are further developments in Guam. There's, of course, the decision to the agreement with the Philippines for 4 additional military facilities there. Those strike me as changes in American force posture, which is to say the United States is distributing its forces further around the region, essentially as a defensive response to the growth of Chinese missile capabilities. But what the United States is not doing is reinforcing its actual military capabilities. There has been really no significant growth in American military capabilities in this region since the Cold War. It's happening at the margins. There are some examples, but really, given the scale of China's rise as a military power, we are at the point now where if the United States was really truly serious about countering this threat in the way it says that it is, that dramatic gestures are called for, such as, for instance, essentially leaving Europe to the Europeans and moving your forces across to the Asia Pacific. I mean, if the United States really was serious, I think, then gestures of that magnitude are now called for. And yet, not only is that not happening, there is simply no prospect of that happening. So I think ultimately we do have to question American motivation. And this is not a dig at the United States at all. I mean, the United States is inherently a highly secure country. It will remain a very powerful country. And ultimately, I would say that China's rise as a strategic power in the Asia-Pacific region does not threaten America's core security interests. And so to take on a contest of the scale of the one that is now being proposed against China, you need a damn good reason. And at the moment, I don't think the United States has that reason.
Yeah, we discuss this here all the time at the Quincy Institute as to what ultimately are America's core interests, because one can define them away and also inflate them to a point where almost everything becomes core. And then that perhaps is not sustainable. Very important points. I want to pick up a question from a viewer. This is Jan Weinberg, who raises the point on UNCLOS, the fact that the US has not ratified it. And of course, Australia is near a region, the South China Sea, and I want to turn to Beck on this, where it is in a neighbor to Southeast Asia, neighbor to ASEAN. And we are seeing Chinese excessive claims in Southeast Asia. The 9-dash line has been ruled as illegal by the PCA, a court in The Hague. There have been clearly aggressive moves by Chinese Coast Guard ships and the maritime militia and so forth. Now, with the US-Philippines announcement that Sam was referring to, there's also talk right now on conducting joint patrols. Philippines and the United States conducting these patrols in the South China Sea, perhaps beyond. And apparently Australia may also join these joint patrols. So just looking at Australia's relationship with the South China Sea question, the neighborhood, how far is Australia going to go here? Where is the Albanese government going with this thing? Does it want to get into the space of the South China Sea to challenge some of China's excesses, work with the Philippines and others? Or is it more, let's say, happy enough to take a more legalistic approach and sort of diplomatic approach to this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it gets to the heart of how Australia sees its interests in the South China Sea, because like the United States, it doesn't have maritime or territorial claims in the South China Sea, and yet here in Australia, we can sometimes hear a lot about the South China Sea. It's that the set of disputes have become almost totemic of strategic competition between the United States and China. This is the key example that is often provided within strategic narratives about China's revisionism. the ways that China potentially wants to undermine what is often referred to as the rules-based order. And so the South China Sea, particularly the 9-dash line and China's, ignoring of the arbitral tribunal ruling in 2016 is really a kind of symbolic of these much bigger issues around China as a rising power and what kind of rising power China wants to be. But to your question on Australia, I mean, I think over the past decade or so, the debates about Australia's activities in the South China Sea have revolved around whether or not it would participate in US-style freedom of navigation operations. So that the US has this freedom of navigation program. One part of that it's a global program. It's not just about China. It's not just about South China Sea. But one part of that program is, doing these operations that directly protest the excessive maritime claims. Now, Australia doesn't have a freedom of navigation program in the same way. It does operational presence. So it has increased its operational presence in the South China Sea. There's more transits taking place from naval vessels, for example, over the past, since around 2014. But they're of a different style. So basically, Australia says we have our own way of sort of asserting our maritime rights in areas such as the South China Sea, and it's different from the United States. And there's a range of reasons why politicians have decided not to go down the path of US-style freedom of navigation operations. And one of them, which is outlined very clearly in Malcolm Turnbull's autobiography, is that they'd be concerned about whether or not the United States would get involved if Australia were to somehow become entangled with a Chinese naval vessel conducting a freedom of navigation operation. So that's quite an interesting passage. But there's also been talks of joint patrols with Southeast Asian states. But yeah, so it's not as if Australia is absent. Leaders have been content in conducting business as usual because Australia also hasn't wanted to unnecessarily provoke China in a way that might be harmful to Australian vessels or even Australian naval personnel.
I'm going to turn to another question from the audience, and this is from Hassan Ali, and I'm going to ask you, Hugh. Hassan wants to know, where do ordinary Australians sit on the Taiwan question? But take that question and maybe you can expand it a bit more on Taiwan. Is Taiwan, here in the US, Taiwan is the core of the debate on China on many fronts: security, in terms of the first island chain, democracy, freedom, international law, and so forth. Where do things stand in Australia? Is Taiwan a burning issue in the Australian public at large, within the government? What is the Australian approach towards Taiwan?
Look, it's really interesting question, Sarang. I mean, I think, you're absolutely right, of course. Taiwan has become, if you like, the linchpin question about where US-China relations go. And that's not just because of Taiwan's significance in itself as a democratic country, as a major source of semiconductors and so on, or from the Chinese side, of course, as a country to which they have long-standing and deeply felt claims, or an entity to which they have long-standing and deeply felt claims. For both sides, it's become a symbol of their position vis-a-vis the other, ever since 1949, in fact. China's claim, willingness, capacity to prosecute its claim to Taiwan, America's capacity to frustrate that claim, have been seen by both sides as symbolic, even constitutive, of the maintenance of America's position in the Western Pacific on the one hand and China's challenge to that position on the other. That, of course, issue was managed and smoothed over with all sorts of rather artificial mechanisms in the years between 1972 and, shall we say, 2017, when the rivalry between the US and China became explicit, and it's now again right at the forefront. And I do think that does make Taiwan a very dangerous place. Look, I think in Australia, it's very clearly understood that on the one hand, a US failure to support Taiwan militarily, if China moves militarily against Taiwan, will be very serious and perhaps fatal to America's standing and position credibility as a key strategic player in Asia, let alone a leading strategic player in Asia. And for that reason, some recent polling by Lowy, for example, I think last year it was, Sam will correct me if I'm wrong on that, showed a strong majority of Australians would actually support Australia going to war to support the United States in a conflict over Taiwan. On the other hand, I don't think many Australians have any conception of what that would mean. Australians have a long tradition, as is often noted, of going to war with alongside the United States on just about every opportunity. But we haven't been to war with a power like China alongside the United States. This is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. This is completely different. And I think I don't think the Australian public has any conception of what a war with China over Taiwan would be like. I don't think they have any clear conception of the fact that this is a war that the United States is very unlikely to win. And it's a war which is, I think, very likely to go nuclear. And I therefore think that this is a question of much greater seriousness than the Australian public understands. And that's one of the reasons why I criticise the new government, the Albanese government, for not being franker in explaining to the Australian public their position. On the one hand, they're taking these steps, as Sam has outlined, which do very strongly indicate a willingness to support the United States in more or less whatever happens militarily in the Western Pacific. And on the other hand, it doesn't explain to Australians why that's worth doing, why that would be a sensible war to fight, particularly if it's a war that you don't expect our side to win. So I think, for Australia, the Taiwan issue is, as it should be in a sense, totemic of the broader question, and our failure to conduct it and for the government to lead a sophisticated, properly informed debate on the issues related to Taiwan and what that should mean about the broader questions about how we manage China's rise is, in my judgment, a broader failure to respond effectively to the very difficult strategic circumstances we're undergoing. I mean, you made the point before, Sarang, that good statecraft is often the business of balancing conflicting imperatives. That's true, but good statecraft is also a matter of making the choices that you have to make. To govern is to choose, as I think it was President Kennedy said. And that's really, it's really important that Australia understand what its objectives in Asia are. What kind of regional order does it want? And I don't think our new government has a very clear idea about that. And I think it's important that they clarify that.
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to stay with you, Hugh, and actually pick up on something you said about a war over Taiwan, which we all hope will never happen. But if it does, you said that it will likely go nuclear. Now, we are seeing in Asia a sentiment in different forms of greater, let's say, comfort level with the idea of nuclearization. So, of course, North Korea has gone very far in that process. We've also seen polls in South Korea on this issue, where a large majority of the public wants South Korea to have its own deterrent. That issue came up when President Yoon was in Washington. Australia is a country of 20-odd million Australians. China is much, much larger, much more powerful. It will get richer in time. Where is Australia, even if this is being said in whispers, on the question of acquiring a deterrent? Has this been discussed? Is it being discussed? Should it be discussed? What do you think?
This is a very big and interesting question, Sarang. Look, I mean, you're absolutely right. I do think there is a change in the sort of broader question of nuclear proliferation in the Western Pacific, and obviously the South Korean position is a very interesting one here. I must say, I myself am very uncertain that the Washington Declaration from last week of a new committee for Seoul to discuss with Washington the circumstances of nuclear use is going to do anything to ameliorate the uncertainty in South Korea that the United States, now it faces a North Korea with the capacity to strike US cities, would be willing to risk that strike on US cities in order to retaliate for a North Korean attack on South Korea, and therefore the extended deterrent offered by Washington is less credible now than it used to be. And that's a broader question. It's a question for Japan. It's a question eventually for Australia as well. How confident can we be that the United States is so committed to sustaining its position in the Western Pacific that it'll be willing to risk direct attack on US cities by the intercontinental range forces of China? Now, this goes back to the very important point Sam made earlier. I at least, and some others in Australia, are unpersuaded that America's interest in preserving its position in the Western Pacific, of course it would like to do that, but are they strong enough to justify America running the kinds of risks that it ran during the Cold War? And I think because this is not the same as the last Cold War, the Soviet Union and Russia, China are different kinds of adversaries in different global situations. I think it's very hard to argue that the United States is willing to do that. That does raise the question for Australia. If it wishes to preserve a military capacity to manage Chinese pressure in the decades to come, might it at some stage have to contemplate acquiring nuclear weapons itself? I wrote it in the book I wrote, How to Defend Australia. I wrote a chapter on this in which I said, I think it would be a terrible, terrible situation for Australia to find itself in, and it wouldn't find itself in facing that sort of choice until after the point at which Japan and South Korea had taken the same step. But that I could conceive circumstances on which Australia would either have to decide to abandon its claims to be a middle power and essentially become a small power, undefendable, or very seriously contemplate acquiring a minimum deterrent capability. Now, there's no national debate about this in Australia at the moment, but I would just make this observation that when that chapter came out and attracted a little bit of attention in the debate here in Australia, what I expected, I must say, was a huge upswelling of resistance and even anger towards the idea that we would ever contemplate that. In fact, what I discovered was a surprising number of people came up to me and said, yeah, that's an interesting question. We might have to think about that. But I stress, it's not a current question. It's a question that emerges as Australians, if Australians come to understand that America's presence in Asia and its role in upholding Australian security in the future cannot be guaranteed as it has been in the past.
Indeed. As unipolarity, yes.
I would just add to that, just one final point on that Australia could never take that step without, at the very least, the acquiescence and at best the agreement and cooperation of Indonesia. Because if we ever took that step and Indonesia was against it, we would suddenly find ourselves in a far worse security crisis than the one Australia's nuclear weapons are designed to prevent.
Yes, and indeed, Indonesia has also raised concerns about AUKUS on the proliferation issue. So this seems very pertinent. Beck, I want to end today's conversation with you. And you can pick up on any of these points raised by Hugh or Sam, but I also want to get to the climate change question in the few minutes we have left. Certainly on one policy issue where the Albanese government is radically different from the Morrison one is climate change. And there's a domestic component, but the foreign policy dimension of it, do you see significant action from the Albanese government working with President Biden on climate change in the region or elsewhere?
I think we can expect there to be some announcements coming pretty soon in terms of Australia-US, how climate change might be being worked into the alliance. I mean, at the moment, both domestically and internationally, there's been a sort of dramatic shift in the language, and Australia has sort of committed itself to more ambitious climate change targets, but there hasn't been too much of a policy change. There has been funding announcements connected with ODA. Indonesia, for example, there's a climate change fund that the ALP committed Australia to. But in some ways, the language is like that matters. Like that's at the heart of the diplomacy part of it, particularly for our Pacific Island neighbours, is Australia being able to recognise that these countries don't necessarily see China as being the major existential threat. They see climate change as being the major existential threat. So there will be, I think, some domestic challenges in Australia generating a more ambitious climate change policy, because that has been the history of climate change policy in Australia. But even just, having a government that doesn't try to deny that it exists is a positive step, I think, in thinking about Australia's relations with the region.
Great. Well, we could keep talking. But it's an hour, it's the top of the hour, and we must all go. Thank you so much to all three of you for again joining us. We hope to do this again next year as well, if not before. And thanks for all your insights. Thanks to the viewers, and please stay tuned for more of our very interesting conversations here at the Quincy Institute.